So I have both a paper and a PowerPoint. The paper contains subtle, detailed arguments laid out in great detail. I just want to show you that the paper exists. I will not read it. I will just give you the shortened version of the PowerPoint, and that way I can make up stuff as I go along. Okay, so the title of the talk is Time and Consciousness, and what I'm interested in is an issue at the intersection between two central questions in the philosophy of time. The first question concerns the relation between the human time in which our own experiences unfold and the physical time that features in our best theories of motion, of the motion of objects and the propagation of fields. The second question is a question of what, if anything, is special about the present moment. It's a question whether there's a fundamental metaphysical difference between the present and past and future times. Now, in my experience, philosophers who come out of the continental tradition tend to be more interested in the first question and often end up according an important role in the philosophy of time to human time. Analytic philosophers often tend to accept that physical time is fundamental and spend more time on the second question. At all events, what I'm interested in here is a question that falls in the intersection of the two. And that is a question of whether phenomena of consciousness allow us to make a principal distinction between the present and other times. That is, whether consciousness allows us to mark the present. Now that question is falls in the intersection of the two broader questions. But by answering it, you don't answer the other two questions. For example, if consciousness doesn't mark the present could still be metaphysically special in some other way. And if consciousness doesn't mark the present, there could still be some other interesting relation between human time and physical time. For example, the question I'm asking is silent on the issue of whether or not the phenomenon of the species present tells us something interesting about the metaphysics of time. So that's my question. Does consciousness mark the present? Now, if you wanted to answer this question in the affirmative, you would have broadly two views to choose from. One option we'll call option one, is to argue that consciousness generates presentness. That is, that facts about which time are present are generated by facts about consciousness. So in this case, without conscious beings, there would be no present at all. I should note, though, that this view doesn't require that you also adopt the stronger thesis that human time is fundamental and that without conscious observers there wouldn't be any time at all. For example, Lynn Rudder-Baker has a view that she calls the BA theory, and I'm going to say a little bit about that in a moment, according to which human time is merely complementary. So on Baker's view, if there were no conscious observers, time would merely lack an interesting feature, but time would still exist. So that's the first option. Consciousness generates presentness. The second option is to argue for the contrary view, that presentness generates consciousness. So in this case, what's kind of exciting about this view, if you can hold it, is that there is no consciousness except at the present moment. So that the consciousness is one of the side products of presentness. So one example of this view that I want to discuss here is Peter Ford's glowing block view, which is a traditional growing block view, supplemented with the additional claim that consciousness only occurs at the edge of the growing block. Okay, so those are the two options that I want to discuss here. And the thesis that I want to defend is that neither of the two options is tenable. And the underlying problem, which I think is a more general problem for anybody who thinks that the present is metaphysically special, is that the view that consciousness marks the present requires what I call a property theory of presentness, and I shall try to argue that properties of presentness are incoherent. So in my view, consciousness doesn't mark the present, but human time could, of course, still be interesting in other respects. So that's the plan. We have these two options. Consciousness generates presentness, presentness generates consciousness, and I want to show that both options fail. So let's start with the thesis that consciousness generates presentness, and by way of an example, let me say a little bit about Lynn Rudder-Baker's BA theory. The BA theory is said to combine features of the traditional A and B theories of time without collapsing into either. And the kind of interesting aspects of Baker's theory is that the A features of time are said to depend on the presence of self-conscious observers, and here's a quote by Baker. An event's occurring now depends on someone's being judgmentally aware of it now. So on this view, without judgmental awareness, there's no presentness. But since we have this combination of an A and B theory, if there were no conscious observers, time would still have all of its regular A properties. Okay, to explain what I think to spell out what the view is and what I think the main problem with the view is, let me introduce a bit of fancy notation. I want to use A for the relation of judgmental awareness. So AXE means that some agent X is judgmentally aware of some event E. I also want to use the stroke for the true at relation. So T stroke phi means that at time T, some claim phi is true. So T is any time, and I've got all those times, and one of the times is the present time. And it is supposed to be special. So let us use P as a name for the present. Then Baker's thesis is that what makes it the case that P is present is that at time P, there's an X, there's some observer X, and there's some event E, such that X is judgmentally aware of E. That is what makes it the case that P is present. Now, more can be said about what judgmental awareness consists in on Baker's view and why she thinks that her BA theory of time is a good theory. Let me skip over all of that and move straight to what I regard as the fundamental problem with the view. So here's the objection. Clearly, people were judgmentally aware of events in the past. We know that by memory. I was judgmentally aware of stuff 5 minutes ago. So that is true. So if we use the standard past tense operator P for it was the case that, it is true at the present moment P that it was the case that someone was judgmentally aware of something. So that's true at the present moment P. But in virtue of the definition of the past tense operator, that means that there is some time T that is earlier than the present time P, and at that time, somebody is judgmentally aware of some event. So here's a little picture. So here we have the present moment. What makes the present moment present is that somebody is judgmentally aware of something. But it's also the case that somebody was judgmentally aware of something, but that means there must be an earlier time T at which somebody is judgmentally aware of something. But that just means that the very same thing that was claimed to have made P special, namely that somebody is judgmentally aware of something, is also true of the earlier time T. So the other time T is as special as the present time P. So we don't get a distinction between the present and other times out of Baker's proposal. At best, we get a distinction between times at which people are judgmentally aware of events and times at which nobody's paying attention, if you wish. This problem generalizes to a general objection to what I call property theories of presentness. That is, take any proposed hallmark of presentness, call it N. So what N would allow you to do is the following. Imagine all the times, and you know what's true at what times, and you wonder, well, which of the times is present? Well, according to the property theory of presentness, you just have to figure out which of the times has that property N. Which of the times has the hallmark of presentness N. Well, suppose we have some such proposal, a hallmark of presentness. Well, since by assumption P is present, at P, N must be true. But only one time is present. That means that if P is N, then it's not the case that there's some time T that is distinct from P, at which N is also true. So by modus ponens from 1 and 2, we get, there's not the case that there's some time t different from p at which n is true. Okay, that's the first half of the argument. Now, a second assumption is that, well, some past time was present. There's unless you're prepared to accept the view that there's only one time, the present. Then there's going to be some past time that was present. That is now true that n was the case. And again, using the definition of the past tense operator, then follows that there is a time t that is earlier than p at which n is true. However, by the earlier than relation is irreflexive. There's no time is earlier than itself. So it follows from t being earlier than p that t and p are not identical. So we can replace the earlier than sign with a non-identity sign, and we get 6. But 6 is just a negation of 3, so we get a contradiction. That is, on pain of contradiction, there can be no hallmark of presentness. There can be no feature that is true that's true only of the present, but that was or will be true of other times. Now, at this point, you might say, well, wait a minute. What I did here is that I spelled out Baker's proposal in what you might call untensed terms. I spelled out the proposal in terms of what is true at a time. And the objection is, well, look, by spelling out the view in untensed terms, I'm missing the point of the proposal. That is, the real issue here is that only at the present time p is n presently true. In the past, it merely was true. And in the future, it will be true. And that is the difference. And by spelling out in untensed terms, I've completely missed the point of the proposal. Well, I don't think that's right. The proposal was that consciousness generates presentness, not that the presentness of consciousness generates presentness. If there's such a thing as the presentness of anything, well, that surely would create nounness. But that's a different proposal. It's not the proposal that we're considering here. The proposal we're considering here is that by looking at the time series and looking at when facts of consciousness obtain, we'll be able to figure out which time is present. It isn't that we look at properties of presentness. So there might be some other view on which the present is special, but it's not one on which presentness is generated by consciousness. It's a view on which presentness is generated by presentness. I don't know. So property theories of presentness are incoherent. And I would like to point out that that is not a feature that is peculiar to time, but that the same issue arises for modality. Now, in his discussion of theories of actuality, Robert Mary Adams considers what he calls property theories of actuality. And from there I derive the property theory of presentness term. So the question he asks is the following. Take all the possible worlds. And Adams' question is, well, what makes it the case that one of these worlds is the actual world? One proposal that he considers, the property theory of presentness, is that, well, there's a property. The property of, property theories of actuality. So we have all the possible worlds, we wonder which of them is actual. The property theory of actuality says, well, there's this property that only one of the worlds possesses. It's the property of actuality. And here's what Adams says about that. And hopefully that will look familiar. He says, well, each possible world is actual in some possible world, namely in itself. How then does the actual world differ from the other possible worlds in relation to the primitive property of actuality? Well, the actual world has the property of actuality, of course, and not just possibly. To have a property actually is presumably to have it in the actual world. So the actual world has the property of actuality in the actual world, but that only tells us that the actual world is actual in itself, and every possible world is actual in itself. So how is the actual world different from all the other possible worlds? So we can turn this again into a reductio of property theories of actuality. So suppose that A is some proposed hallmark of actualness. Now, in order to get the argument right, similar to the other reductio I gave, I also need some contingent truth phi. You'll see why we need phi. So some claim that is actually true, what might have been false. So we have this extra premise 0. So phi is true in the actual world A. So let A be a name for the actual world. And then by assumption, the actual world is actual. So the actual world has the hallmark of actualness. So in the actual world A, uppercase A is true. But only one world is actual. So given that A is actual, it's not the case that there is a world W that is distinct from A that is also actual. So by modus ponens, we get that it's not the case that there's a world W distinct from A, which A is true. However, some other world might have been actual. In particular, phi might have been false because it is a contingent truth. So it's true in the actual world that, and here I'm using the diamond for it is possible that, the possibility operator, in A it is true that it is possible that not phi is actual. So phi, by the definition of the diamond, to say that something is possible, is to say that there's some possible world in which it obtains. So from 4 it follows there's some possible W in which A is true and not phi is true also. There's A is true and phi is false. However, from 0 and 1, so there's some other world W in which A is true and not phi is false. But that world W must be distinct from the actual world because in the actual world phi is true. Yeah, so in this world here phi is false, in the actual world phi is true, so there's a world W that's distinct from A in which couple A also obtains. So the reason we need that contingent truth is that unlike the earlier than relation, which is irreflexive, to say, so the past tense operator really takes you to the past. But the possibility operator doesn't always take you to other possible worlds because people think that everything that is actual is possible. Yeah? At all events, now we have 6. 6 is a negation of 3. And we can get our contradiction. So that is the reductio of property theories of actuality. Okay. So here that is my argument against the thesis that consciousness generates presentness. And notice that the argument against property theories of presentness was for any proposed hallmark N of presentness. It could be something that involves consciousness in some way or other, but it need not. It works against all property theories of presentness. But in particular, the thesis that consciousness generates presentness requires a property theory of presentness. Property theories of presentness are untenable, so consciousness doesn't generate presentness. So that kills off option 1. Now let me move to the second option, which is the view that presentness generates consciousness. So does presentness generate consciousness? Now in this case, if you want to hold this view, you already need to have some view on which the present is metaphysically special. Because if you have a view of time on which there really isn't any feature of presence, or which all times are alike, then you're not going to get this second kind of view. So let me kind of briefly review three main views about the metaphysics of time. So we have the presentist view, that only present objects exist and the past and future are unreal. Then we have eternalism, or the block view, which claims that past, present, and future are all equally real. And then there's the in-between view, the growing block view. The present and past are real, and the future is unreal. Future does not exist. Now looking at these three views and thinking about, well, how could we get a view on which presentness generates consciousness out of them? I think we can quickly rule out eternalism because eternalism doesn't make any distinction between the present and other times. There's no real presentness on the eternalist fiction. Now the presentist view you might say, well, on the presentness view, it's true that presentness generates consciousness in that you can only have consciousness in the present. But that's not an interesting connection between presentness and consciousness, because on this view, presentness generates everything. All there exists in the present, so the existence of everything is predicated on its presentness. There's no interesting connection between presentness and consciousness on the presentness view. But let me put that aside as well. The growing block view, at first blush, doesn't seem to offer much hope either, because if you think about the growing block is a little bit like the eternalist view in that we get all these layers of reality and just keeps on growing. And the present here is not intrinsically different from the past times. So what we get is that the present right now is like all the past times, but it has the extrinsic, is only extrinsically different in that as of now there isn't any stuff to the future of it. But then once we get another layer, the intrinsic features of the present don't get changed. And we just get more stuff added onto it. So here the present isn't intrinsically different from any of the past times. So that doesn't seem to offer that much hope either. However, there's a version of the growing block view that does seem to promise an account in which presentness generates consciousness. And that is the glowing block view with an L, as due to Peter Forrest. And here's how the glowing block view goes. According to Forrest, only beings that exist at the edge of the block are conscious. The past is a dead wasteland inhabited by zombies. There is no consciousness in the past. It only occurs at the edge. So let me go back. I don't claim to understand why he thinks this view is correct, but so the idea is that consciousness occurs just there and there on the edge of where, at the edge of actuality and potentiality. He talks about the frisson, right? That kind of happens here. It's a very special place where the block grows. That's where consciousness is. It's a little bit like a tree. There's what's it called, the Cambrian something. Where the tree grows. It's dead on the inside, but it only grows on this thin layer on the outside. So that's the view. Peter Forrest's view. And that really is a view on which presentness generates consciousness. You don't get consciousness unless you have this growing edge of the block. So, as with Baker's view, let me just skip over the reasons that Peter Forrest has for endorsing this view. And let me come straight to what I think is its main problem. The main problem, I claim, is that it conflicts with what I want to call the future-past principle. Here's what I claim is a necessary truth about the past and future. The future-past principle is that what is present will be past. So here I'm using the future tense operator F. So if phi is true, then it will be the case F, that it was the case that phi. Right? What is true now will be past. But if that's true, then the passage of time doesn't make us zombies. I'm conscious now. That's a fact about me now. And perhaps I'm now at the edge of the growing block, and there might perhaps more stuff being added to the block. But at some future time, it still would have been the case that I'm conscious. So here, so granted for sake of reductio that I'm now at the edge of the block and I'm conscious, the addition of more layers to the growing block cannot undo the fact that I'm conscious now. So in 5 minutes, we'll end up with a block where there's consciousness in places other than at the growing edge. So being left behind by the passage of time doesn't make you a zombie. In particular, more generally, this means that a time cannot lose the hallmark of presentness. So I don't think that presentness generates consciousness. It conflicts with the future past principle. Now at this point, I should say that I'm trying to beat Tamar, who so far he gets a gold medal for staying in time. So I have to hurry up. So here's something that the glowing blocker might say in response to this. He said, whoa, wait a minute. I reject the future past principle. Why? Because the future past principle is about the future. And I'm a glowing blocker, but I'm also a growing blocker in that I think that the future is unreal. So you're making a claim, you're assuming a claim about the future. I will just reject it. Well, I don't think the glowing blocker can make that claim. Because also the growing blocker, well, the growing blocker might say that, well, the future is unreal, but it's not as if there are no truths about the future. The growing block view itself is a claim about the future, namely that the block hasn't finished growing yet. More stuff is going to be added to it. So there are going to be extra layers of reality in the future, according to this view. And moreover, once these extra layers have been added, presumably all truths of logic are also going to obtain of that additional subject matter. So we can't just reject the future past principle because it's about the future. But more needs to be said about this here at this point, in that we need to have an account that is amenable to the growing blocker about what the openness or the unreality of the future consists in. Now, one way of thinking about this, and I think the only coherent way of thinking about it, is in terms of a branching time. So here we are at the present moment, P. The past has been settled. Past is, all past times have been decided upon. The sense in which the future is open is that the time series are to be branches, and branches into all possible futures. Now, it hasn't been decided yet which of these paths we will take. Now, in this case, if you have such a view, explaining how the future tense operator works turns out to be a little bit tricky. There are two different views that you can have about the future tense F, it will be the case that. One is, you say that at time T, a future tense claim, it will be the case that phi, is true if and only if phi is true in some future branch. That's one view you can have. The other view you can have is that such a future tense claim is true just in case phi is true in all future branches. That makes a difference to your tense logic with which of the two views that you adopt. Like the first one keeps your logic fairly standard, but it has a slightly bizarre consequence that all predictions turn out to be true. It's now true that it will rain tomorrow, and it's now true that it will snow tomorrow, and it's now true that I don't know, the heavens will open and will rain honey, because there's some possible future in which this happens. In this case here, the second one, I think that's usually the account that open futurists adopt. This one's a little bit nicer. See, in this case, you no longer have the consequence that that all future predictions are true. On the contrary, really the only things that are true at all future times, I think, are logical truths, something that's true in all possible futures. And here it's important to remember that when we talk about this branching time series here, in the case of the open future, it's a special kind of branch, where all possible branches are represented. So something can only be true in this sense, a future can only be true in this sense, if it's a necessary truth. So this is pretty, and that also has the consequence that no future tense claim that contains a contingent phi turns out to be true. But if you have this view, or then you account of what it is to be for, what it is for, it is not the case that f phi to be true at P will turn out to be a little bit complicated, and your logic either is going to be 3-valued, or it's going to have truth value gaps, whatever. So here the logic turns out to be a little more difficult. Let me skip over that, because whichever account of future tense you adopt, the future past principle will hold either way. Why? Because the open future only contains a future tense operator. The past tense operator, there's no branching in the past direction. So if something is true at P, then if you view P from any of the future branches, you look backwards into your past and into the past of that branch, you will always end up with whatever is true at P. So the upshot of this is that there's no coherent account of the growing block or the glowing block future, glowing block view on which the future past principle is false. It's a truism about time. What is present will be past. Okay, so I've argued that it's not the case that consciousness generates presentness. Also not the case that presentness generates consciousness. So the conclusion is that consciousness doesn't mark the present. So the question I started out with was an intersection of the one question about the relation between human time and physical time, and the question about the status of the present. So the question in the intersection I want to answer in the negative. There's no interesting connection between consciousness and presentness. Now that doesn't settle the two broader questions, but in closing let me just tell you what my view about these other matters is. I think that physical time is fundamental, that consciousness is just another physical process, and that the present is just another time. Thank you. 30 minutes, Taman.
We have a lot of time for questions. So, go ahead.
There's a lot to digest.
And the reason I spoke fast, to make it hard to follow.
So I'm going to start just to warm up with a very simple question on a possibly a minor issue, and that's about the open future.
Yeah.
I don't understand the sense in which the future is open. Say, if we just assume that the laws of physics are deterministic, then the openness of the future must be just epistemic. I mean, and so just for the sake of the argument, if you could say something about, I mean, given determinism, what do you mean by the future is open?
Well, I would say that's water on my mill. Right? I don't think the future is open, and precisely for reasons like yours. And you see, what you need, if you think about this picture here, where we say that there are all these different possible futures, and the openness of the future consists in it being unsettled which of them will obtain. You need to have some notion of possibility.
Given the past, given the present, under determinism, there's only one possible future, namely the one that continuously, continues the trajectory. It just so happens that we don't know which one is that, but so it could be only epistemic, given determinism.
Look, I think you're absolutely right about that. How you could have an interesting open future view under determinism that is coherent, I don't know. I'm not an open future guy, right? So I just granted this for the sake of argument, because just looking at the specific claim that there's an interesting connection between consciousness and presentness, it's like even if you grant the glowing block or all of this stuff, that there's a coherent account of the openness of the future, it still doesn't help, because you still get the future past principle. But I think you're absolutely right. Yeah.
Yes. It's a side issue.
Well.
Yeah. So, if I understand correctly, and I'm sorry if I'm compressing, I may be in this compression leaving out something important, but basically your claim against the possibility of presentness is that once we say that the present is special in any way, and I like the generalization you made beyond ecology. See, it doesn't matter how we want to mark the present as special. Whatever way this moment, or this present event is special, 5 minutes ago, that moment or present event was special, and so where's the speciality? So speciality is every moment is special at its time.
Yeah.
Is that roughly?
Yeah.
Yeah, but that's more or less what the way B theorists wanted to kind of grant experiential present all along. You know, at every moment, present are those events that are simultaneous with that moment. And so we have all these various accounts of how we resurrect experiential time using this tenseless relation. The point I was trying to make before in my talk was that this leaves out entirely what needs to be resurrected. I mean, it's true that this moment is present and that 5 minutes ago, or I don't like to talk about the presentness of moments, because I don't think moments in themselves have temporal properties. But your talk is the present event, and at this time yesterday, I think it was either David Wood or someone else's that was present, and that talk yesterday was special yesterday. Your talk is special now, and that's true. But there's a huge asymmetry between the two, and that is that your talk is in the future of, and I don't want to, causality, I agree with Nathan Oakland or another. I don't want to introduce causality, but there's a big, I mean, presentness is very important and very nice, but it comes along with pastness and futurity, which I think just fly out the window in these accounts. So there's this big asymmetry. Now, I agree with you. It's not you're looking for metaphysical specialness. I've never understood what it means to be metaphysically special. You know? I can be special for my kids, but there's nothing metaphysical about that, and I don't understand what metaphysics. So I am with you completely there. Still, I think there's I'm a realist about the present. I think there's a real property some events have, which is they are present. Other events don't have that. Other events have it. I agree with you. Still, other events will have it. But there are big asymmetries here
Let me two remarks. I think the view that you introduced in the end, where you talk about events having properties of presentness, that's a very different view from the one I discussed here. But with regard to what you said in the beginning, is that yes, it is true that here we are, and the present really does feel special, and there seems to be an asymmetry between the future, which we can only kind of access by anticipation and prediction, and the past that we access by memory. Yeah, so in that sense, there's really this important. The present really does seem to have this special feature, but of course, 5 minutes ago, that time was special in exactly the same way.
Yeah.
And
that's why.
So
just erase the word special. Yeah. This event is present. It's not special. It's present. That's all. The only thing it has is presentness. Doesn't make it more or less special than any other event. It just makes it present. And 5 minutes ago or yesterday, a different talk was present. It wasn't more or less special than your talk.
Well, but at that time, that moment was present.
Sure.
And at this time, this moment is present. So look, in that case, you end up with a view in which every time is present.
No. Only when it's present. I don't want to say every event is present at its time, because that's basically the B theory. So B theorists can re-embrace the presentness very happily and say, sure, every event is present at its time, just like every object is located wherever it's located. So we're again spatializing the temporality. That's not what I want to say. I'm saying, to be present, there is a hallmark of presentness, and that is that only present events can be experienced. They don't have to be experienced to be present, but if they're not present, they cannot be experienced.
There's only events that happen now can be experienced now.
That's what I...
So only events that happened 5 minutes ago can be experienced 5 minutes ago.
That's the B theory.
But you don't think it's true that only events that happened 5 minutes ago could have been...
Could have been.
Could have been.
Could have been.
You try to, I mean, you were very clear that you don't want to assume a tenseless language, because that would be to beg the question. But if you're not assuming a tenseless language, then I think there's a big difference between saying that something was experienceable yesterday or a million years ago, And saying that
Okay, let me try to make a distinction between two different theories. I think they're both untenable, but only if argued against one of them. And you seem to be sympathetic to the other one. One is that what I call the hallmark of presentness is something that would allow you to do the following. Looking at all the times, you wonder, well, which of the times is present? And what a property theory of presentness would give you is that, well, some property that one of the times has, the other ones don't, and that is what makes it the case that that time is present. Likewise, a property theory of actuality will allow you to look at all the possible worlds, and there's only one world that has that property of actuality. Now, Adam's argument against the property theory of actuality is that, well, every world represents itself as actual. Every world is actual in itself. So likewise, the problem with property theories of presentness is that every time represents itself as present. So if there were a hallmark of presentness in that sense, every time would have it. Now, the account that you propose isn't one that postulates a hallmark of presentness or a property of presence in that sense. You have this kind of primitive property of presentness. So in that case, it would be the presentness of consciousness that makes it the case that this time is now not merely a consciousness.
Harry?
I think I agree with your main point against the, what you call the growing...
The glowing block, yeah.
So, I agree with that. At a given moment in time, you can't be both a zombie and not a It's nonsense. Forest view seems to lead to that, therefore I agree it's wrong, it's inconsistent. It should be rejected for that reason. I think that shows, though, is that, or maybe it shows even that what you might call the one-dimensional version of the glowing block is inconsistent. But you put two-dimensional. So you have a meta-time here, and the glowing block there. Each one's going to look glowing different, bigger and meta-time. So you don't have, you got the picture?
Yeah, so it would be like a two-dimensional glowing.
It's a two-dimensional with a leading edge all the way down, which is glowing at the tip of that particular rock as it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. I don't think the explicit introduction of meta-time saves the view from this view from the consistency you're talking about. The view itself probably has no merit whatsoever.
What?
Maybe a way of marking the present if you could go two-dimensional in a very explicit way.
Well, if you have a two-dimensional view, okay, now I have to try to remember how that argument went. Well, one problem that you're going to have if you have a two-dimensional view is that you then have at least two different future tense operators. You can either, so we have regular time and then we have super time. How's that? And so we have the future tense operator and the super future tense operator. And you can also think about a diagonal future tense operator, right? And the question then arises, well, which of these different tenses of future is plain old future? Now, at this point, you might say, well, future is ambiguous. And my response is going to be, well, it isn't. When I worry about whether or not it's going to rain on Friday, I want to know whether I should bring my umbrella. I worry about plain old future Friday. I don't worry about super future Friday. I just worry about Friday. And it's going to be, so you have to pick some sense of future in that two-dimensional array that corresponds to the plain old sense of future. And for that sense of future, we're going to get the same constant, we're going to get the same thing back.
Okay.
No, so the argument turns out to be messy and complicated. Perhaps I'll email it to you. Try to convince you and see what you think.
My question is about the future past principle, because if I remember well after prior discussion about determinism, it should be, you can't accept it as it is. You can have restriction on that if you want, if you don't want to get into determinism. So in his book, he's talking about, I don't remember all the details, but there is one option by Occam and another. How you limit this one? Because if you don't limit the future past principle, then you get determinism. This is what if I remember correctly, his argument is in his classical book on time and modality. So I don't think that you must accept it as it is. Now, of course, the question is then, what about the truth that you said about the future? But there are two options. One of them is you accept truth about the future, but you don't accept this principle. And the other is that, in a sense, you accept this principle, although there aren't any truth about the future. So I don't think, if you go into the details of his actually fascinating discussions, goes back to all the issues of time and modality and the master argument and how you solve it. So I think one of the things is that you don't accept it as it is, and if you want to avoid determinism. And there are ways of avoiding it, even formal ways. So.
Okay, I'm going out on a limb here because I don't remember the details of his argument. So are you sure it's the future-past principle rather than past-future principle? See, okay, yes.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure. It was in the past, and the past is not that clear. And
okay,
the consciousness is in the present.
See, so here's
if I remember correctly, this is the problem. It's a problem about.
Here's an interesting. If you think about this principle, so on the glowing block view, you get that principle. What you don't get is the past-future principle, or at least on the second interpretation. That is. Suppose, there's something to point to this thing. Okay, suppose there's P, and then we move to the lowest branch. Yeah, suppose at P we're wondering, is there going to be C battle tomorrow? Okay. I thought that was to control the audience. Okay, so here we are, and we wonder, oh, there's the flotilla headed towards Gaza. Will there be a sea battle tomorrow? And so as of now, the future is open, the facts aren't in. Right? So there's some possible future in which, I don't know, the flotilla sinks, one where they peacefully go to Gaza, another one where there's a sea battle. As of now, there's no fact of the matter. And so going back to Meyer's question as well, so this might be a case in which the future has not yet been determined. But if you think about the past-future principle, so suppose we're now down here. So it is true that there was now we're in the midst of a sea battle. But it's false that there was going to be one. But because if you say it's true now that there's a sea battle, but if you go back in time, it's not true that in all future branches from P, there's a sea battle tomorrow. Right? So that's so the past-future principle in this case is false. And should say that there's a
true according to one, it's false according to two.
Yeah. So on this, and I think most people adopt this view. And so the past-future principle, that is false, and that just making this up as we go along. That might be the one that he was concerned with when he was talking about determinism. Incidentally, there's a version of this of the open future argument due to Storr's McCall that saves the past-future principle. So he has this view. It's called branch attrition. So as we move to the future, all the as we have this big tree, future tree. As we move to the future, all the unrealized possibilities get chopped off. Right? So now, given that now there's a sea battle, if you go back to P, there are no longer these other branches. So there's some variants that preserve the past-future principle, but it's the past-future principle, I think, that's tied up with determinism. So this one. So also the interesting thing is this one.
I look at it at home, and I would say tomorrow give you the answer. I don't know. I think it's this one because the other ones is, of course, you don't want to accept it. But here it's as if it is more evident to accept this principle, and if you accept it, you have problems. So.
Yeah. No, also, so one nothing, and then. So the interesting, if you think about the past-future principle, and that the kind of sophisticated version of the paper, I should talk about that. The future-past principle, in some sense, reflects the fixity of the past. Right? It doesn't branch in the backwards direction. Whereas the truth of future past principle reflects the fixity of the past, and the failure of the past future principle reflects the opposite, the openness of the future.
Yeah, but this goes back to the master argument, because one of the solutions to the master argument is to say that the past is open, because you have possibilities in the past. So this is why.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll think about it.
I don't know. I would just make up stuff.
Okay, yes, please.
Okay, maybe it's possible to characterize the present not by property, but by lack of property. I want to suggest that you can say that for every t except of the present, there exists a time-different delta t, where you can say that something is true. There is certain fact. You are conscious, like this. I was conscious 5 minutes ago. But you can't say the sentence about the present. There is no delta t, if you add it to the present, where you can say something is true. So, because you prove that it's not possible to characterize it as a property, but here there is an absence of property which may be characterized as present.
Well, if the argument against property theories of presentness goes through, it doesn't actually require a property of presentness in any particularly exciting sense. So the proposed hallmark of presentness doesn't need to report the presence of a natural property or anything else. It could be anything descriptive, and that could include claims like the ones that you envisage. So if the argument goes through, I would hope they will also...
So there should be some contradiction. I propose the property that doesn't exist in the present. And there is no delta t that you can add to the present. You can say that anything is true because this is in the future.
Well, but there's a claim that would be, if it's a claim that's true in the present.
This is the claim which
Yeah.
is...
Yeah. So that would be a case where you don't have a property of presentness. Property theory of presentness in an interesting sense, in that your kind of presentness relies on the absence of a property. But I think you would still run into the problem because n doesn't need to report the positive presence of a property.
Yes.
I was wondering if the zombie argument is a bit too much of a straw man. I mean, yesterday I wasn't a total zombie, but I was a little bit of a zombie. What theory of your old self, can you hold? Because there is a sort of, there's a difference between old selves and present selves. That perhaps is not as extreme as being a zombie, but.
Well, but, whatever you were like yesterday, that's how you were like. Right? It's not as if that, yesterday were the edge of the block. It's not as if by adding another layer to the block, the previous layers got changed. Right? So yesterday this was the leading. So this was the leading edge of the block, and then we can put another slab. We had dinner and all that. The addition of these blocks didn't change what you were like yesterday. But in terms of a straw man, it's like, well, look, I think it's a crazy view to think that there's an interesting connection between presentness and consciousness. But people hold these views and they hold them in print. So I think that's a legitimate challenge.
I wanted to ask if anything changes in case you add the option that the universe evaporates. I mean, if there's no option which is true in all future branches.
You're absolutely right that the future-past principle, one way of thinking about the future-past principle in tense logic, where you try to characterize features about the time series in terms of principles for tense operators. This is one way of saying that this is a theory of your tense logic, or one of the axioms, is to say that there's no last time. Right? Because whenever you have a time, there's going to be another one. Right? Here, in order for this to be true, if phi is true at some time, well, there has to be some time to the future of phi at which phi was true. So you're right in that. Okay. To the extent to which it isn't obvious that we haven't arrived at the end of time, this isn't a truism about time, right? But it's one that the growing blocker is committed to it if he or she thinks that the block is going to continue growing. But you're absolutely right that.
But it could end. It could
Right.
continue blowing until it ends. We could never know when. Maybe on Friday
Yeah.
it won't rain because it would be
Yeah.
no universe. In that sense,
Yeah.
the future is open. Could be.
Well, so that would
You
be
accept that.
well, that would be a view in which there's no future. Right? Time's up. Right?
But we don't know when.
Pardon?
We don't know when.
Well, but that I mean, whether or
We
not
can
we
have
know.
a limited future.
But whether or not we know that time's up, that's a different question. But I take it to be part of the view of the growing block view. And I was kind of a little bit. I moved over this a little bit quickly. Well, yes, you can reject this principle, and then you get a coherent view. But it's really just a growing block view. So it's just eternalism, where only at the last moment of time people were conscious. That's a consistent picture of what temporal reality looks like. But if you have a view, if you have a growing block view in which you think that the block continues to grow, then you must accept this principle. Because then you think there will always be another time.
No, I don't understand why.
So why?
If I accept, for example, for myself, I know that tomorrow I'm going to be a day older.
Yeah.
And I expect that to be every day, but I could die. That's a possibility. In exactly the same way, I could suppose that the universe is going to progress in glowing or growing until it dies.
Yeah. No. That is true, but the question that raises is the question of how the growing blocker knows that the growing block view is true, or even necessarily true, and that there will be more times after this one. And I don't think it's a necessary truth. So you're absolutely right, you can avoid this problem just by denying that there can be any future times. Like, just as you can avoid the problem of that are raised for property theories of presentness by denying that there are any other times. And you can avoid the problems for property theories of actuality by claiming that there's only one possible world. Right? You know, Leibniz thought that. Some interesting things. Right? There's really only one world. All truths are necessary. Oh, so you're absolutely right that there are ways of getting around this problem, but I think that's throwing out the baby with the bathwater, and that you no longer have the view that you start out with.
Okay, well, time is up, but I hope we still have a future because there's another talk, so thank you very much. יש לך מצגת?
Okay, yes. Do you need this, Dror? Yes. Wash it off.
I have a paper and I'm going to read something.
Excellent.
Okay, our next and last speaker for today is Dror Yinon, who is teaching at the program for hermeneutics and culture at Bar-Ilan University, and he will speak to us about changes order on Deleuze's notion of time.
Thank you very much. So, as it is the end of the day and everyone is tired, I think I'll take my time, whatever it takes, because no one would have the energy to protest. So, but anyway, what I'm going to do, it turns out that what I'm going to do, I didn't know that before, that I think I'm going to take on from Tamar's presentation of James, and especially of Whitehead, and give you the French version of it. So, I hope it will be interesting. So I don't want to repeat things that were said during the day about the distinction between the objective and the subjective and the human and the physical. And I have also a paragraph on this, but I'll skip it because what I wanted to do is really to discuss one of the central currents of modern philosophy, transcendental philosophy, that suggests a project that challenges this very separation of the objective and the subjective through an ambitious attempt to ground what we call objective time in the subject, thus making the nature of time a primary concern for any investigation concerning the nature of subjectivity. And I refer here mainly to Kant, Heidegger, and Merleau-Ponty. Now, this might complicate things as it brings to the combination of the terms subject and time other senses that are not intended in the subjective time of our initial distinction. But even this point alone only makes it more interesting for the discussion of time that might be missing something, our discussion of time. The extent to which ignoring this more complicated possibility might be constitutive of the distinction itself can be learned from the fact that McTaggart understood Kant to be on his side, simply rejecting the reality of time. Within McTaggart's framework, time would be real if it would be first possible to predicate temporal properties of events. Yet for Kant, and I quote, time is not an empirical concept that is somehow drawn from an experience, but rather grounds a priori anything that can be given within experience. Thus, times being an a priori condition for experience is characteristic of the transcendental tradition. This means that the question is not whether time is real, as time is one of the conditions that sets the terms of what it is to be real. Rather, the question is how to understand time once we accept its transcendental status. The both attractive and controversial feature of the transcendental treatment of time is the insistence upon a deep and intimate relation of time to subjectivity, which can be explicitly formulated as dependency relations. As Kant had put it, if we remove our own subject, or even only the subjective constitution of the senses in general, then all constitution, all relations of objects in space and time, indeed space and time themselves, would disappear. And as appearances, they cannot exist in themselves, but only in us. While time is tied to subjectivity, subjectivity shouldn't be thought of as independent of time. It is clear within the transcendental tradition that at least a significant part of an account of subjectivity must be given in temporal terms, and this direction was developed by successors of the transcendental tradition, such as Heidegger, as we saw Michael yesterday, and Merleau-Ponty, who writes, to analyze time is not to follow out the consequences of a pre-established conception of subjectivity, it is to gain access through time to its concrete structure. Clearly, this direction of development only deepens the grounds for holding the above Kantian contention that had there been no subject, time would disappear as well. Yet, this doesn't mean that the transcendental position gives up its ambition to account for objective time. The idea is that even if time, after being investigated transcendentally, is dependent upon the subject, it should empirically, or in the mode of everydayness, or from a natural attitude, be grasped as if it were independent of the subjectivity in which it is grounded. Okay, so this subjective account, this transcendental subjective account, is committed also to give reason for holding a position empirically as if time is like we think of objective time. Thus, it seems that the transcendental position attempts to accommodate two somewhat opposing intuitions. The first is that time must be comprehensive with regard to everything that happens, and as such it should be independent of anything that occurs in time. While the second is that much of the sense that we relate to time is possible only with regard to a subject for which it is meaningful. As Merleau-Ponty writes, time presupposes a view of time. It is not a real process, not an actual succession that I am content to record. It arises from my relation to things. And he adds, while on the other hand, he adds, the objective world is too much of a plenum for there to be time. Transcendental philosophers have tried to solve this inbuilt tension by securing the continuity of the objective notion of time with its subjective ground. Thus, Kant secured the passage from the subjective origin to the objective use of time by arguing that time is given as an infinite representation, while Heidegger insists that while temporality is primordially finite, it provides the meaning structure that confers sense upon objective conceptions of time. Gilles Deleuze's difference interpretation should be read, and the case of his discussion of time makes no exception, as a part of this transcendental tradition which sets its framework and provides it with its problems, even if Deleuze joyously invites to his party other philosophers such as Bergson and Nietzsche. Deleuze seems to agree with the transcendental philosopher's basic claim, yet he affirms it with a qualification that I believe to be crucial when he writes, time is subjective, but in relation to the subjectivity of a passive subject. I believe that this comment gives us an access to a view that might challenge the basic objective-subjective distinction. But first, let's go back to the main features of a transcendental approach to time. According to such an approach, time cannot be derived from experience, but should be taken as an a priori condition of experience. Time is dependent upon subjectivity. Subjectivity is the origin of time, which in turn provides the meaningful content of subjectivity itself. Finally, it is committed to establish a connection that will secure the intuitive, though misleading, independence of time, such that can serve later on to the development of scientific conceptions of time. Now, it is with no doubt that Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty could accept a certain version of Deleuze's comment on that the subjectivity to which time is attached is passive. But what I would like to argue here is that Deleuze's comment is more subversive than it appears. The investigation of time with relation to a passive subjectivity leads to a claim that time transcends subjectivity, or that subjectivity is not the origin of time. This doesn't mean, however, that time becomes objective, but rather that we might want to revise our initial subjective-objective distinction. Now, we saw already that with regard to this initial distinction, the transcendental approach holds a richer sense of subjective, but it still retains a distinction only to suggest a hierarchy in which the objective is grounded in this transcendental subjectivity. Deleuze's account of time goes further to question the distinction itself. As we shall see, the analysis of time goes through the analysis of subjectivity, yet it reveals that time is not dependent upon the subject. This, however, doesn't mean that the analysis of time can be done with no relation to subjectivity. So we must go through subjectivity just in order to discover that time is not really dependent on subjectivity in at least the traditional way that was believed to be. The transcendental investigation of subjectivity remains then the access to an understanding of time. And time is still regarded as a condition of experience. However, time is not dependent upon subjectivity in the sense that subjectivity is revealed as its origin. The important consequence of Deleuze's investigation of subjectivity is that time is ideal, but not subjective. That is, Deleuze suggests a notion of ideality which is not attributed to subjectivity. This might accommodate better the two intuitions which I pointed out earlier. The intuition that time is not dependent upon a subject, and the one that sees time as pervaded with ideality. Thus, what might be wrong in the transcendental approach is the reduction of ideality to subjectivity. In what follows, I would like to present briefly Deleuze's central discussion of time in the second chapter of Difference in Repetition, on repetition for itself, and then point to some of the consequences of this Deleuzean notion of time with regard to the transcendental approach and also with regard to McTaggart's framework. And I hope I will have time for all this, I'm not sure. So, before I proceed to the presentation of Deleuze's discussion of time, I will describe the context in which it appears. It is important to note that Deleuze's discussion of time doesn't address directly questions framed by the philosophy of time, like we saw today and yesterday, but rather emerges within a wholly different framework which calls for a preliminary clarification. And it's not an easy task, believe me, but I'll try. Delueze's project in difference and repetition is to give an alternative to the Kantian account of the transcendental field and its relation to experience. Without going into too much details, Deleuze argues that the Kantian notion of the transcendental is limited to conditions of experience that only account for the possibility of something to appear or to be given, while what a transcendental account should do is reveal the principles that are active in the production of experience. Thus, rather than providing an analysis of fixed constraints on experience as Kant does, Deleuze attempts to find active principles that will account for the dynamic of experience while not a priori fixing its limits. This, of course, is not a matter of a philosophical taste, but rather emerged from a critique of the Kantian model itself. Finally, this critique leads Deleuze to argue that we need to understand anew the notions of difference and repetition that play an important, though implicit, role within the Kantian framework of experience. A crucial point for Deleuze's argument is that difference and repetition are transcendentally active principles which do not presuppose subjectivity, a cognitive representation-based agency that constitutes objects and has an experience-independent status, but rather explain genetically its production within experience, the production of the subject. The context then of Deleuze's discussion of time is his investigation of this new notion of repetition. These considerations lead us back to Deleuze's comment with regard to passivity. Starting with repetition as a principle, whatever is generated is repetition's product. Thus, if subjectivity is an outcome of repetition, whatever happens, happens to the subject and not by the subject. But it would be too hasty to see subjectivity in everything that is formed through the activity of repetition, even if it necessarily has an ideal aspect to it. Now, repetition is the transcendental principle that generates subjectivity and also allows us to see its limits. It does so with regard to both of its aspects, its temporal character and its psychological structure, which I'm not going to discuss now. So I'm only going to deal briefly with the temporal argument. As we already saw, the view of subjectivity as the origin of time is deeply rooted in the transcendental tradition, and thus Deleuze sets an alternative to this basic transcendental convention by showing that there is indeed a connection between subjectivity and temporality, but this connection is established by repetition that produces different syntheses of time which reveal the different layers of subjectivity, or better, ideality, among which subjectivity also emerges. The basic insight with which Deleuze starts his discussion of repetition and time is that, I quote, repetition changes nothing in the object repeated, but does change something in the mind which contemplates it. Thus, all that is needed for repetition is that there would be an active ideality which generates a synthesis. This synthesizing ideality doesn't presuppose subjectivity, as we shall see here. Contemplation shouldn't be understood as a representation, and hence not as subjectivity, and the synthesis it generates turns out to be temporal. The different temporal syntheses are attached to different faculties that unfold passivity on all its facets, and by way of doing that suggests a fresh look on the nature of time. I will pass then to a brief presentation of the three syntheses of time. I believe that I'm going to skip it on the second. Now, in order to have a general picture of what I'm going to talk about, I will give you the order in which Deleuze's syntheses proceed with relation to passive subjectivity and with relation to the different temporal dimensions. Thus, with regard to the order of passivity, the syntheses proceed from imagination and sensibility through memory to thought, and with regard to temporal dimensions, it starts in the present through the past to the future. The first, most simple activity of repetition is the contraction of instants. Deleuze borrows his examples here from Hume and Bergson. So let's take the Bergsonian example of the church bell announcing the hour, let's say 4 o'clock. Now, what happens here is that the ringing of the bell repeats, but the repetition should be in something else that contemplates the ringing of the bell. Otherwise, there would be no second, third, and fourth ringing. Indeed, what happens here is that we get repetition through what Deleuze calls contraction. The impression of 4 o'clock is synthesized by contracting certain instants, in this case, the ringings of the bell. This repetition through contraction is an ideal change, as it cannot be attributed to the thing, to the bell itself. Yet Deleuze argues that it happens on a level that is not yet subjective in the sense that involves representation and memory, but what Deleuze, following Jung, calls imagination, which is a broader ideal faculty which doesn't involve yet subjectivity in its full sense. But we'll see that it goes deeper. The ringing immediately generates a contraction that happens to an individual who cannot be attributed with the execution of such a synthesis. Now, this example is only an illustration and already belongs to a much higher level than the one which Deleuze aims at. What Deleuze points to is an organic level that precedes sensibility and actually forms it. Thus, a more adequate example that Deleuze brings is heartbeats. The heart beats, that is, it contracts and then dilates, and so on. This beating of the heart is repetitive, and as such, hopefully, of course, and as such involves contemplation. Yet this contemplation doesn't represent the instants, it makes of them a beat. Thus, the sense of contraction here includes the dilation. Now, such syntheses on the organic level occur incessantly in every organism and generate organisms as habitual. Forming habits, then, is a basic expression of repetition as contemplation. This means that ideality already appears on the basic organic level. Indeed, Deleuze writes, and I quote, "A soul must be attributed to the heart, to the muscles, nerves, and cells, but a contemplative soul whose entire function is to contract a habit. This is no mystical or barbarous hypothesis. On the contrary, habit here manifests its full generality. It concerns not only the sensory motor habits that we have psychologically, but also, before these, the primary habits that we are, the thousands of passive syntheses of which we are organically composed." That's the end of the quote. This synthesis is the synthesis of the living present. It is finite not because we cannot think of an infinite present, but rather because an organism has a certain capacity of contraction. This gives the organism a specific duration of present. A specific duration of present, a specific rhythm, and I quote, "Contraction necessarily forms a present which may be exhausted and which passes, a present of a certain duration which varies according to the species, the individuals, the organisms and the parts of organisms under consideration," end of quote. Within this living present, past and future do not appear as independent moments, but rather as dimensions of the present itself, having an organic sense to it, as past is heredity and future is anticipation. An example that Deleuze gives, think of the situation when a chicken pecks a grain while already anticipates the next. The whole behavior, the whole habit is explained by that. Okay, so I think I think I'm okay. Now this synthesis leads to an active synthesis that involves the understanding and memory, and it is with active synthesis that we get, as it were, an ordinary notion of time, where the past and the future are thought of as moments that are separated from the present. As this is an intellectually based synthesis, there is no problem in principle to arrive at a notion of time as infinite. A crucial feature of this synthesis is representation's role in it. And it's nice because one of Ulrich's formulas showed just this, what I'm about to say. In temporal terms, representation means that the actual present represents a former present. Thus, what is distinctive in this synthesis is that when a former present is represented, like in what Deleuze calls active memory, it is represented in such a way that the actuality, I'll say it very slow, that the actuality of the representing present is also being reflected. So when you reproduce a former present, you must know that you're reproducing it now. in the actual present. So somehow the actual present must represent itself, be reflected. What is traditionally referred to as subjectivity is related with active synthesis. But I will move on to the passive synthesis of the past because it's more of our interest as we're interested in passivity. So what is presupposed by the first synthesis is that the present can pass. Otherwise, habits would stop and nothing would happen. This means that another time, or more precisely another synthesis of time, must be presupposed in order to allow for it, because, as we previously saw, the living present cannot explain its own movement. Memory is understood in this synthesis not as a function of reproduction, as in the active synthesis, thus relying on the present, but as preceding the presents and providing them the ground upon which they can pass. And I quote, "Habit is the originary synthesis of time, which constitutes the life of the passing present. Memory is the fundamental synthesis of time, which constitutes the being of the past, that which makes the present pass." End of quote. Now, the discussion of this notion of the past is rich and complicated, but I will only point out the following. This past is a past that was never present, because as we just saw, in order to pass, the present always already presupposes a past. Thus, this past has a different nature from a present that had passed and became a former present. So it's a fixed past. It's a pure past, what Delueze and Bergson, following Bergson, calls a pure past. So, in a sense, this past precedes the present and exists along with it. Transcendental memory is presupposed by the living present and also by the understanding and memory of the active version doesn't matter. Finally, this past contains all presents, actual or former, and thus it functions like the global version of the act of contraction in the first synthesis. In the first, we had a contraction that captured a finite set of instants to form a habit, a rhythm, and a local present. And with the second, we get a past that contracts all presents, because if the passing of the present presupposes such a pure past, it must contract all presents, because no present can be thought of as outside this past. Thus, the succession of presents that occur on the background of a pure a priori past is gained, but this synthesis also makes time. This synthesis also makes time closed upon itself, creating a circle where former presents and actual presents coexist. Now, there is much to be said of this situation, but what is important for us here is that by providing the ground where the present can pass, by allowing movement, time becomes attached to events, that is, the passing presence. Now, as repetition acts on all levels of subjectivity, by that differentially repeating its own act, it acts also within thought. This aspect of the third synthesis is crucial for my argument that it is through the investigation of subjectivity that we come to the conclusion that the subject is not the origin of time. But I cannot go into all the details, but I will only say that Delueze argues that a close examination of Kant's position with regard to the relation that holds between thought, the phenomenal subject, and the time being the intuition in which this subject is given, due to that, in view of that, it is justified to hold a position that Kant wouldn't accept, that thought is not the spontaneous activity of the subject, but rather that the I think, the core of subjectivity, cannot be attributed to the passive phenomenal subject. Hence, thought should be taken as determining the subject, and not as the act of the subject where it determines itself. Consequently, the subject is ultimately revealed as passive at the point which is supposed to be her highest form of being active. This determining act is also a temporal synthesis, and hence can be viewed as the temporality of thought. Now, the synthesis of time can be ordered as advancing from the contraction of instants in the living present to the comprehension of all the presents, of all events within a pure past, and repetition's act in the third synthesis then applies to time itself. It is the form of time. what would be the form of time? This can be answered from a perspective where time is, I quote, liberated from its overly simple circular figure, freed from the events which made up its content, its relation to movement is overturned. In short, time is presenting itself as an empty and pure form. Time itself unfolds instead of something unfolding within it. End of quote. This pure and empty form is, as we saw above, a determining act. And what it determines here is a distinction between a before and an after, setting by that the inner form of time. This determination of before-after distinction is what Delueze calls the form of change, and thus the form of time is the form of change. And in my conclusion, I will refer to the distinction that is suggested here between movement and change. Now, this synthesis is considered as a synthesis of the future for several reasons. One, for example, being that it is supposed to systematically guarantee the openness of the system of experience to the new, as it seems closed upon itself from the perspective of the second synthesis. Thus, we can say that for Delueze, it is not that the future that is open, but rather it is the future that opens time. This is, however, less important for us here. What is important is that this synthesis can be seen as a metatemporality operating from within time, thus synthesizing it as dynamic in a way that cannot be found in the first and second synthesis. If we look then at the three syntheses, we get a complex and rich notion of time that provides a pulse or a rhythm in the first synthesis, a passage and movement together with containment in the second, and a change as a determination of before-after distinction in the third. So now I get to my conclusion, in which I want to see what Delueze has to, in what way Delueze differs from his transcendental predecessors, and to elucidate a bit with the help of McTaggart the import of what Delueze has in mind. So I would like now to. We saw that Delueze should be read as thinking about time within the transcendental tradition. Delueze accepts that the question of time should be dealt with in the context of a theory of experience, and that time cannot be derived from experience but is presupposed by experience. He also agrees that the first move would be to turn to subjectivity in order to investigate the nature of time, and hence he apparently accepts the transcendental hierarchy between the subjective and the objective notion of time. But this turn to subjectivity brings Delueze to argue first that the subject itself has the character of the synthesis of time, which are not effectuated by the subject, but happen to her. And second, that we should reject the identification of ideality with subjectivity, or rather the exclusivity of the subject with regard to ideality. Thus, beyond challenging the transcendental attempt to determine a hierarchy between the subjective and the objective, Delueze challenges the distinction altogether. Just think, for example, on the first synthesis of time, the living present. It doesn't manifest any unique human or what we would traditionally call subjective traits, but there is repetition in the act of contraction such that there is a change within a mind or ideality that contemplates the repetition. Is this living present internal? Is it external? This is exactly the point. It must be thought of as ideal, but it demands an irregular understanding of ideality, an ideality that is not subjectively structured, as would be, for example, a Hegelian type of such an ideality, and doesn't set a limit to the possible experiences or provides an anchor to possible meanings within a world. Rather, it should be thought of as productive of these experiences and meanings. Thus, we can see that although Delueze holds that time is ideal, we cannot simply attribute to him a position like temporal idealism, that is the thesis that time is transcendently dependent upon the subject. This means that in Deleuze's case, time's being ideal doesn't prevent it from directly applied to processes in the world, as it is not mediated through subjectivity and projected as a kind of an interpretive scheme upon the subject surrounding environment, human history, or cosmological history. We can also conclude with regard to a more specific interest of the transcendental tradition that due to the synthetic structure of time, it makes no sense to determine whether time is finite or infinite. The living present is organically dependent, hence it is finite. But the second synthesis is placed within transcendental memory that can be thought of as infinite or embracing the whole of time. while in the third synthesis there is no sense at all to think of time as finite or infinite, as it is of time's character as the form of change. The whole of this structure generates different temporal levels that fit different aspects of experience, and with it a certain level allows for different and even competing conceptions of time that emerge, I believe, from the characteristic of the second synthesis, both active and passive. By this, Delueze also retains a transcendental trait of the discussion of time, which is committed to provide a structural reason for the possibility of thinking intuitively, as it were, about time as objective in the regular sense of the term. Now, if we turn back, just a minute. Now, if we turn back to the question whether there would be time had there been no subject, I believe that Deleuze's answer, deviating from its transcendental predecessors, would be definitely positive, as it follows from the distinction between subjectivity and ideality. However, in light of his notion of time, the question should be modified, and we should ask whether there would be time without a world. And I think that with regard to this question, the answer would be negative. Yet this answer is also grounded in transcendental reasoning. The whole activity of time or of repetition through the synthesis of time is the production of experience. Thus, thinking of time without a world would imply a sterile, idle time, which is impossible for Deleuze's understanding of it as directly and necessarily operating within experience or producing experience. A different question would be whether subjectivity itself, in its active sense, having been dethroned from its status as the origin of time, should be thought of at least as necessarily deriving from this notion of time. Here I believe that a probable Deleuzean answer would be that given this productive character of time, some kind of subjectivity would ultimately emerge, because, as we saw, subjectivity in the sense of an active subject is merely a certain modification of a more comprehensive ideality. Now, I would like to finish with a clarification of the sense of thinking with Deleuze on time as changes order, and for that I will focus on the third synthesis with the help of a McTaggartian perspective. First, it is clear that the sense of past, present, and future viewed from a transcendental perspective given by Deleuze cannot be given the same sense as in McTaggart. In the first synthesis, past and future are dimensions of the present and not separated moments. In the second synthesis, I believe that it is impossible to speak genuinely of a future. If it were possible, there would be no third synthesis. However, due to the way in which the past, through transcendental memory, is synthesized, I don't think one can speak of the future in that context. The third synthesis, similarly to the first synthesis, makes past and present its own dimensions. So again, no passage between A properties in McTaggart's sense is formed. However, McTaggart claims that, I quote, where there is no A series, there is no time. Thus, I think it would help us to clarify. It would help us clarify Deleuze's notion of time if we see whether the fact that no A series in McTaggart's sense can be justified from this transcendental perspective is problematic, or reflects a disagreement over the background assumption that lead to McTaggart's claim. I believe it is the second option, and I think that this disagreement allows us to see the full import of Deleuze's sense of temporal change and its contribution to the understanding of time. And with this, I will finish. I have another page. McTaggart's notion of time can be characterized as external and as passing. What do I mean by the externality of time? Here I refer to McTaggart's claim that, I quote, changes must happen to the events of such a nature that the occurrence of these changes doesn't hinder the events from being events, and the same events, both before and after the change. End of quote. Change, that is, time, with its A properties of past, present, and future, shouldn't interfere with the identity of an event. For McTaggart, then, events are fait accompli, such that if A properties were to be added to them, it would not change anything about them except for the change itself, that is, the A property. Yet this means that changes are external to events and do not really change anything within them. From a Deleuzean perspective, this would exactly mean that time is sterile. What exists in such a way that it can be accounted for independently of time. From these assumptions, McTaggart had drawn the justified conclusion that it just might be impossible to add time to existence. The only tiny chance to have time within existence is to think of time as a means of transportation that makes no internal difference but only moves events or things from one place to another along the timeline. This movement doesn't change anything. This movement that doesn't change anything is exactly what McTaggart calls change. Thus, he actually reduces change to movement. This means that the essential character of time is its passing. If time does anything at all, it is to pass. Now, and this is also another version of the spatializing issue of time, or that's what I want to argue. Now, we can clarify Deleuzean time by pointing to the disagreement. First, we saw that the externality of time means necessarily that time is sterile. And we saw, on the other hand, that Deleuze's notion of time is based on the understanding of time as productive with regard to experience. Second, the idea that events are completed in themselves independently of thinking about them in temporal terms is widely accepted in the philosophical tradition, mostly, I believe, tacitly from a logical or conceptual perspective, but intuitively it seems odd. If there is something that distinguishes between events and things, it is that events are temporal from the start. Now, what should be the temporality of events might be open to debate, but what Deleuze has in mind is that the change as an act of determining a temporal difference of before and after is the form of time, and derivatively it is that which makes events what they are. In other words, time itself has the form that is manifested in events. This means, of course, that time cannot be thought of as external to events, and events cannot be thought as being independent of temporality. Actually, Deleuze just might have the opposite problem. That is, while McTaggart thinks of events in terms of things, Deleuze extends his dynamic temporal thought over things, such that they are ultimately viewed themselves as events. This brings us to the last point, which is the character of time as passing, or what is called the passage of time. As you can see by now, Deleuze rejects the reduction of change to movement, and accordingly, he rejects the passage of time as the most fundamental feature of the temporal. Passage, as understood above, merely transports a thing or an event from one place to another, leaving it intact. But change acts from within as a distinction of a before and after, which generates an inner dynamic. Think about everyday photos that you can see in the newspaper of before together with an after. Okay? Diet ads or something like that. There is little sense in thinking of the difference between the photos on the model of a movement from one place to another. What operates behind the scene, literally in this case, is an act that makes a difference, which is the sense of change for which Deleuze argues. Although for Deleuze the third synthesis of time applies to time itself as the form of time, this example might illustrate the sense of this temporal change as making a difference of before and after. Instantly, okay? And being a philosopher of difference, it should come to us as no surprise that Deleuze's notion of time as the order of change is one of making a difference. Thank you very much.
Dror.
Just a reference. What is the McTaggart text that you're?
The unreality of time.
Which one?
The unreality of time. The article from Mind. Yes.
I was just wondering if it's perhaps it's not truly correct to look at the Kantian subject and the Deleuzean subject in a comparative way. I mean, the Deleuzean subject is much different than the Kantian subject.
That's exactly what I tried to show, yeah.
So perhaps there isn't truly a loss of subjectivity or objectivity in the time, but perhaps there is another sense of subjectivity that arises, which is more complex in Deleuze.
Maybe, but anyway, anyway, it revises the traditional notion of subjectivity, and then you have to extend subjectivity over, I don't know, just about anything, okay? Flowers, turtles, yeah, okay, so we can, but then I think that we'll just confuse the terms, and I think that what Delueze gets at is that there is a sense of ideality in what I quoted in the muscles and in the nerves and in other organisms that, on the one hand, doesn't give a special status that you can locate as a subject that is central and controls everything that happens, representing itself, its world, its environment. And on the one hand, and on the other, you cannot just understand these, at least Deleuze thinks that way, that you cannot understand these behaviors and actions only on a, I don't know, on a mechanical, physicalist or whatever, neurological account. So you need to have some sort of a local, ideal, what you call soul that contemplates this thing and does and accounts for the repetition. Okay, this is the idea. So I think that what is interesting here is that you can have a broader notion of ideality broader than subjectivity. So subjectivity is just an outcome and a contingent outcome of such an ideality under special circumstances. Now, with regard to Kant, I think that you must go this way because Deleuze, I mean, at least from a perspective of interpretation of interpreting the text, because Deleuze is committed to this Kantian construction and criticize it from within Kantian passages. So I think that was what he had in mind. You're very happy with this lecture, I'm sure.
I'm very happy, yeah. A bit less happy by how long this day is, but I'm happy it ends like this, yeah. But you said towards the end of the lecture that passage is not essential for the day.
Passage is located at the second synthesis, and this is not enough. So it's not. He thinks that there is a notion of change that gives the dynamic of time. That at the end, if you take only passage, time wouldn't be really dynamic. Okay, you would just have the problem of specialization. That's right. Not that passage doesn't belong to time. There is pulse. There is passage. There is rhythm, there is passage, and there is change. You need all three of them. I think that what he adds is this notion of change, not notion of passage.
Okay, so the distinction between before and after rests on the notion of change, right? Change.
Yeah.
And then what work does passage do, if you can?
Passage gives you the experience of the succession, of presence, one after the other. That's what it does for Deleuze. Also, then you can go to, it depends on where do you want to slice the presence. You can do it like, the photos that slice movement. But normally what we experience, and I think you would agree, that one events come after the other. This is your experience of succession, but what I didn't discussed so much is this very weird notion of the pure past, which contains all of the presents. So the way in which these presents are experienced by every one of us is a bit misleading because, in a sense, they exist already. Okay, it's just that we experience them as succeeding each other, although that from the point of view of this transcendental memory, which is not our memory, we're not. This memory is not, transparent to us. They all coexist. So this is exactly why Deleuze thinks that this kind of passage is not enough, and you need to add this notion of change.
But it still relates
those two movements together. I mean, later on, with his books on cinema, what he called the false movement, changes in space, also relate to the real movement, which is the change in the inner system.
Yeah. Well, I don't.
It's not like they are completely different and are not related.
What
the movements?
No, I didn't say that they are completely different and they do not relate. They relate in a very intimate way because, again, I didn't delve into it, but there's a sense of repetition that I didn't give all the picture of the conic view of. So in the books on cinema, Deleuze returns to be Bergsonian, and I suspect that he deserted this notion of change, and he shouldn't have. I think it's more interesting like that.
Time is élaboration. I mean, time is creation, or it's nothing at all. I mean, it's
that's right.
Time for him at the end. I mean, open systems, all future is open.
Yeah, but I think that here he gave something more structured to justify it. That's what I think.
The same issue is how do you see the connection between direction of time and
the what of time?
The direction of
direction.
Time. The place of direction of time is connection to repetition and change. Is it time is derivative or considered to change of time?
I didn't understand the question.
How do you see the direction of time, this connection to change and repetition? In your opinion, how Deleuze connects?
Again, it depends. In the first synthesis, there is a direction to time. Okay.
There is not.
There is a direction to time and he also has a discussion of the direction of time, of the arrow of time. I think in the when he discusses, he has a short discussion of thermodynamics, but then, well, this gets a bit complicated. I think that if I refer to this discussion, then again, I don't think that he wants to deny if there is a direction of time. I don't think that he's against. The thing is that for the before-after distinction, it's not the main issue. Okay, it's not what is important, because if you get a before-after distinction, but you do not get it, you don't think of it as something happens and then another things happen. What you get is the form. That is, you get the distinction. So you get an inner difference in every event or in each thing or in time. This is the form of time, that you have an inner difference that, I don't know, makes a thing dynamic, makes it move in a good sense that Deleuze wanted to get at. And I think that what Tamar has shown before, what Whitehead had in mind, maybe, I don't know. So this is the important thing. It is less important if afterwards you can take a measure and say that it moves in this direction or that direction. Okay? It has a change.
Just when you started, you began by contrasting the transcendental tradition with theme, like the distinction between conscious time and cosmological time. But I think that in a sense, and you talk, I think, about Deleuze shows it, that when we think about consciousness of time, we think always about human consciousness of time. And in this sense, there is a continuation of Kant. And I think Deleuze here really proposed something else. That we should, break something, understanding, of course, about temporality, but also the way of consciousness of time, in a way, animal unconsciousness of time.
But then,
So it's not limited to the human, higher, what we usually think of as higher capacities.
Yeah. So I totally agree, except that I think it depends on what do you want to say about this consciousness. If you want to give it a constitutive role, I think he would deny. That's one point. The other point is that just to give credit, that I think that Merleau-Ponty started with it in his The Structure of Behavior, because already there he attributes these structural idealities of sense, of meaning in the world to animals and even to physical particles, but he thinks that it's a matter of degree, of complexity. So the human is more complex. Then I think that in the phenomenology of perception he abandoned it a bit and retained and came back to a human-centered view. But I think that in the structure of behavior he has this orientation.
Yes.
Just a point about that. It seems there's something that seems very, very radical about the non-human perspective of Delueze and his example of the chicken and its, history.
No, I think you brought yesterday things that are similar, even with regard to matter. I thought about yesterday. So.
Yeah, but it's
and it was French also. So.
But it's also a very Christian theological idea in which you have a hierarchy about God being the one that can perceive all instances, and then you go down to angels, and then you go down to.
So that's a Neoplatonic, yeah.
Yeah.
No, but
I mean, the radicalness is also retrograde in a sense.
So it's interesting what you said, because Deleuze has something that I take just as something of a show off, but he quotes Plotinus there in these sections. But I don't think that it's that he should be read as Neoplatonic. And in fact, in the same year, he writes a book about Spinoza, and there he discusses Neoplatonic.
Not Platonic, but Plotinus, not Plato.
Neoplatonic is Plotinus.
No, that's Plato.
Neoplatonic.
No, Neoplatonic. Neoplatonic is come from Plotinus. Anyway, he discusses Plotinus's view, and with regard to Spinoza, Leibniz, Descartes, does all the work. And what he supports is a view which is against this ordered universe, because you see what you suggest here is something that under these assumptions would be too ordered, and he has no reason to accept it with his productive conception of experience.
Maybe I'll ask you something too. I don't know Deleuze much. I mean, I've read it a long time ago, but Defense and Reputation. But could you say something? I mean, it seems like there is some, analogy between Kant and Deleuze in various ways. I mean, for instance, when you speak of passivity, it seems like you didn't mention the fact that in Kant you have both intuition, which is passive, and understanding, which is active. Mm-hmm. Of course, the form of time is a form of passivity and not a category of the understanding. And in that sense, you could say that there's some way in which you could go with Kant with this idea of passivity. You would have some kind of distinction between the structuring of time, let's say, in the schematism, and some deeper understanding of a form that belongs to our passivity. And I would say similarly, it seems like there's some analogy between the A deduction, the three syntheses that you have there, and Deleuze's synthesis. I mean, this idea of repetition could go very well with the sense of apprehension as providing some way of having units, and reproduction would give you some idea of passage, but you need, well, maybe I'm trying to
only that
to have change.
I totally agree, and in fact this is part of a project to show just this, that the affinities between the extent to which Deleuze builds on Kant to form his own, criticizes Kant, and from this criticism suggests a new theory of the transcendental. And of course he builds on this notion of passivity. It's only that he takes Kant's distinction between passivity and activity, and he wants to show that the subject is more passive than Kant would have it, and that behind this passivity is generated by something else that makes the subject in an essential way passive, and the active part is much less, or is only seemingly constitutive of experience, but not really constitutive of experience. That's the idea, okay? In a very general way. So, for example, he speaks about passive synthesis. He says that one of the things that he disagrees with Kant is by denying synthesis in passive contexts. Okay, so for example, the three syntheses that you mentioned in the they are all related to representation. So that he would deny.
Okay, so thank you.
Thank you.